All right, Jeff. We love our baseball talk. Mike Vaccaro is one of the most respected voices in sports journalism, longtime columnist for the New York Post, spent decades covering everything from championship runs, the moments that define teams, and now he's got a new book out, The Bosses of the Bronx, the endless drama of the Yankees under the House of Steinbrenner. Mike, congrats on the book. Thanks for joining the show.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. It's a lot of fun to be here. I appreciate it.
So I'm a South Jersey kid, so I always followed the Yankees from afar. And
Sure.
Steinbrenner was this mythical guy. Talk to us about how you decided to tell this story. Specifically, I found interesting through the lens of the Steinbrenner family.
Yeah, look, I didn't want to write a biography because there have been Steinbrenner biographies written in the past. Dick Schaap wrote one 30 years ago, and Bill Madden wrote one 15 years ago that pretty much take it from soup to nuts, from Cleveland to Tampa and to New York. I was interested in the slice of the Steinbrenner legacy that took place with the Yankees, and that involves his family now, obviously, because Hal's in charge the last 16 or so years. And it was really important for me to I talked to a lot of younger Yankees fans who don't really remember the Steinbrenner that you're talking about, the larger than life Steinbrenner, the one that was always on the back pages of the paper, always making strange, odd, sometimes destructive decisions about his baseball team, but always involved, over involved, became kind of an icon of pop culture, improbably enough. And a lot of people just remember, certainly younger generation fans, but also guys of my age who just choose to remember the more recent version of George, which was a more kindly version, and was cheered wildly when he walked into his own ballpark, as opposed to 10 years earlier when the reaction was a lot different. And that's really the story I wanted to tell, was just talking about this many-faceted guy who, for a lot of years, in a lot of ways, owned New York, certainly owned the New York sports scene, and never let you forget about
In the book, I believe the words "the endless drama" appear.
it.
Why?
Yeah, because it was that guy. Seriously, it's funny. Things happen now and then in sports. The Bills fire their football coach, very successful, and in Buffalo, it's treated like the end of the world. That day is like the greatest meltdown or the greatest news volcano in civic history. And that was a Thursday around the Yankees when Steinbrenner was involved. And sometimes it was Thursday morning and Thursday night was a whole different story. And that was really the case. I got a little taste of it later on. I started really covering them every day starting right around 1998 or so. And so I missed some of the glory days, so to speak, of the 70s and the 80s. But certainly I grew up in Long Island, so I grew up around it. So I was very well aware you couldn't be a baseball fan. And I was a Mets fan, which might, cause your listeners to want to click off the dial right now. But I grew up a Mets fan.
Jeff was a Mets
And
fan too.
So was
It's
okay,
I.
all right, there we go. We have solidarity here. But even as a Mets fan, you couldn't grow up and not be aware of the Yankees and not be, overly aware of Steinbrenner. And to try and chronicle those years, that's really the only word to describe it, is drama. It was one thing after another, to the point where sometimes when you read it over, I read this book like a couple of weeks ago after having, of course, written it and let it sit for a while, and I'm like, this almost reads like urban mythology, some of these stories, but they're all 100% true. It all happened. And honestly, I could have written a 1,000-page book, but nobody wanted the power broker version of the George Steinbrenner years, so I let it sit at 375. But that's all obviously what made for such an enticing and irresistible book to write, because of the character involved and the stories involved.
It was exhausting. As somebody who grew up in Jersey City, you'd see these stories, you'd hear these stories about Steinbrenner, and it wasn't just one time that he would fight with somebody. It was constant. Billy Martin was the perfect example of it. Why? One of the things that came out when I was younger was, well, maybe this isn't real. Maybe it's all, created drama for TV. As you research this book, and as somebody who lived part of this, was any of it created, or was it all real?
It was all real. Look, the New York papers at some point discovered that Boss was a lot more headline friendly than Steinbrenner. So they just we started to refer to him as Boss. But he referred to himself as that from day one, literally from day one, 1973. He sent off a note to a player and he said, "Great game, signed the Boss." Sparky Lyle won the Cy Young Award. His wife got a bouquet of flowers. Great job, love the Boss. That's how he referred to himself. He had a sign in his desk, "Lead follower, get the hell out of the way." For better or worse, he bought into his own BS. It wasn't BS. He really believed in himself being a leader of men. He always fancied himself a football coach. he was a football coach early in his career before his father kind of demanded that he join the family business in Cleveland in the shipping business. But he always fancied himself a football coach. He always wanted to run the baseball team like a Woody Hayes would. It's why he made Thurman Munson the captain of the Yankees. 30 odd years after, basically, Lou Gehrig thought they retired Yankee captaincy when he died, but he brought it back because he thought a team needed a captain. He thought Thurman was the captain. He did that. I mean, he was attracted to Billy Martin time and time again because what Billy would give you was the kind of instant, you know, impact that a football coach would have. I mean, lack of a better word. I mean, it didn't always pan out for over the long stretch. Of course, it never panned out over the long stretch with Billy, but that's what he was looking for. He really did. Maybe he fostered his image a little bit. Maybe he was aggressive in pursuing the way people perceived him because he was always on the back page. And that wasn't always because guys like me were calling him. A lot of times he was doing the calling. I mean, the story that Hal Steinbrenner talks about, you can't talk about a father and son who are more different. He says, here's the thing. People think I don't care, but you know what? When the Yankees lose a game in the ninth inning, I throw my shoe at the TV. You bet I do. He said, my father would do the same thing. He'd throw his shoe at the TV when the Yankees lost a tough game. But then he'd pick up the phone and he'd call the Daily News and the Post. And he'd say, guess what I just did? I just threw my shoe at the TV. And all of a sudden he's got 3 days worth of back pages. Hal's never going to do that, but that was what George did. I think it was legitimate, and I think he did everything in his power to augment and foster it through the years, right until the very end when he realized that it didn't make any sense to keep firing people when they kept winning him championships.
You mentioned the different public responses to it, but given the family involvement, how did the Steinbrenners themselves fundamentally change what it meant to own a sports franchise?
Well, I mean, it's funny because nowadays sports is being taken over by corporations, right? The Dodgers are this monolithic, bottomless pit of resources that the Blue Jays kind of are. One by one, you're getting teams just like that are now being owned by a corporate flow chart, not really a person. And it's interesting, the Yankees kind of reversed that. I mean, the Steinbrenner's group in 1973 bought it from CBS, which is the ultimate corporation, right? The ultimate blue suit wearing corporation that had really done its best to wreck the Yankees over the course of 10 years. And so the family ownership was really a breath of fresh air. Now it's becoming more and more unique, but I think that what the Steinbrenner imprint was to make it the family business, make it a civic responsibility, and then make it interesting. And that's also part of the Steinbrenner game. He wanted people talking about the Yankees in January, not just in July. And he did that, whether it was picking fights or just say what was on his mind. That's what he did. And that's how, look, I mean, the Yankees were a depressed asset when he bought it, but they already had and will forever have that logo, which is about as recognizable a logo, as recognizable a brand as there is in sports, maybe in the world, I would argue. I mean, I covered the Olympics once in Beijing, and there were 300 Yankee hats that I ran into during my 2.5 weeks there. So he realized what he had with that, and he built on that. And I call it a unique family store, a corner store owned by a family, but it's the most important corner store in New York City in a lot of ways.
How did the rest of the league look at George Steinbrenner? When you look at like Al Davis, he was constantly fighting with the other owners. At least from the outside, it didn't appear that George was fighting with the other owners the way that maybe Al Davis was.
Well, for one thing, I think the other owners saw that George was good for the sport, good for the game. And they would never say, not all of them would ever admit that. Charlie Finley detested him from the day he showed up. But most of the owners realized that he was good for the product because he made people care about baseball in New York, which is where, it needs to be cared about. You don't always have to have the Yankees and Mets winning, but you have to have baseball in New York matter. And he made sure it mattered forever. It's interesting you brought up Al Davis because Al Davis was a close friend of George's. In fact, they have the same birthday. They were born a year apart on the 4th of July, which is, of course, perfect. And in a lot of ways, people ask me, who the closest owner ever has been to George. And I say Al Davis. People want to say Jerry Jones, but really, what is Jerry Jones known for the last 30 years besides saying a lot of silly stuff? And really kind of just making sure America's team doesn't win anymore. I mean, it's really.
I ain't mad at that. I'm okay with that.
Yes, I don't think anybody's going to have a national day of mourning over the last 30 years for the Cowboys. I'm not outside of Dallas anyway. But Al Davis, if he had owned the Jets or the Giants, I really believe he would have been like Steinbrenner. He would have used the back pages of both papers against each other, and he would have done that game. He was doing it in the relatively sedate atmosphere of Oakland and Los Angeles, so he really never got that kind. But he was, like as you say, I mean, he spoke what was on his mind. And George did too. I think that they had a lot of similarities, They were close friends. In fact, my book starts with an anecdote of me trying to track both those guys down for a story. And George called me at 3:37 in the morning when I was in California, not realizing I was in California. And Al Davis somehow, vetting me before he would call me back, and then tracking me down in a restaurant in San Francisco. So it was they were both unique, interesting guys, especially when you tried to cover them. But well worth it because they were both interesting guys.
He was such a towering figure. I mean, you talk about he called himself the boss from the early 70s. What surprised you the most about him while researching for the book?
I guess the fact that there were moments of real sportsmanship too. You don't really see that as part of his resume or his dossier, right? He's this bellicose guy who the cameras would always see, yelling at umpires from his owner's box. And, one time famously, a third base coach for the Yankees sent a guy home. He was in the 1980 playoffs. Mike Vaccaro was the coach, and the cameras caught him basically cursing out the third base coach, and then basically telling the third base coach's wife on his way out of the seat, your husband cost us the game. That's the image people have of George, and of course Larry David helped augment that a little bit with his over the top impression of him on Seinfeld. But probably my favorite anecdote that I dug up on for this book was after the great collapse or the great comeback, depending on what your zip code is, in 2004. Red Sox fans had kind of taken over Yankee Stadium and started to chant, "Thank you, Red Sox! Thank you, Red Sox!" And Trot Nixon is, pouring champagne on them, and it's crazy. And Yankee underlings are getting really nervous how the boss is going to react to all this. So they go into his office and say, "Boss, I don't know what to tell you. These people won't leave. What should we do?" And much to his credit, Steinbrenner said, "Leave the lights on for them as long as they want to stay. They've earned this," which is something you wouldn't have expected him to say, except that he did almost the same exact thing years earlier, right after the famous Red Sox Yankees playoff game in Fenway Park in 1978. Yaz and Fisk and Freddie Lynn and Louis Tiant are all going back to the clubhouse ready to cry in their beer. And the first guy they see there is Steinbrenner, who wanted to shake all their hands and say it was a hell of a job. I wish both of us could go to the playoffs. And that made a lasting impression on those guys. I mean, here's a guy who's known for just winning at all costs. But that actually tracks because he was very involved in the USOC. I mean, whenever the U.S. has success in the Winter Olympics specifically, there's really a trace to George because he really cared about the sportsman aspect of sports. He also wanted to win all those games that he was part of, but he knew the flip side. He was a good sport. He wrote a column for the New York Post during the Mets Red Sox World Series in '86, and there probably had to be no place else he really wanted to be other than watching those 7 games. So he understood that there was a role outside of him just being the win at all costs, crazy man.
Drama and the chaos may have been good for the brand. Was it good for the team?
Not always. No, definitely not always. I mean, look, I think at the beginning he was able to build something that people cared about, and if it meant that they cared about it because they were lining up against him, the players, the fans, whatever, he was fine with that. And the fact is that in the '70s, he had a bunch of guys who were not only gamers and championship level guys, but they loved going back and forth on the back page. They enjoyed it. Greg Nettles enjoyed nothing more than going back and forth with Steinbrenner on the back page. I mean, Thurman Munson too, Reggie, of course. Bruce Gossage one time famously told a bunch of writers to go up and talk to the Fat Man, bring his message to the Fat Man upstairs. So I mean, these are guys who enjoyed this. But once you got to the '80s, one of the reasons why George never got along with Dave Winfield, among many, is that he wouldn't fight back. George would rip Winfield, and Winfield would smile and say, "As long as the check's clear on the 1st and the 15th, I'm all good, man." And they used to drive him nuts, And the fact of the matter is that the Yankees went 18 years between championships, 1978 to 1996, and largely in part to the fact that George was so impatient, so impetuous. He was always firing somebody. He was always trading Fred McGriff or Willie McGee or Jay Buhner for nothing. And that really cost him. One time, pretty famously, he walked into Lou Pinella's office and said, "Lou, I just won you the pennant. I just got you Steve Trout." And all due respect to Steve Trout and anybody else who makes it to the major leagues, that didn't win them the pennant. In fact, the next time Steve Trout got something like 9 wild pitches in his first 16 innings and wasn't much heard from him again after that. But that's who he was. So yeah, it was definitely counterproductive. And look, Steinbrenner, big Steinbrenner fans don't like me to point this out, but it's true. They had 2 periods of prosperity in his time, right? The '70s team, '77, '78, and then later on. And both of those teams were built in absentia while he was serving suspensions. The first time for Watergate, the second time for Howie Spear and Dave
He
Winfield.
must not have liked that at all, being pointed out.
No, I mean, his family isn't crazy about it either. It just happens to be true. It's not like anybody can argue it. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Gabe Paul built one dynasty, Minnie's dynasty, and Stick Michael built the other, mostly because he didn't have the interference of the crazy Yankee fan and the executives.
All right, I'll wrap it up here. If you could sum up the Steinbrenner era in one sentence, what would it be?
Fascinating. I mean, it was, especially someone who covered it, guys, because you honestly never knew on Tuesday morning what was going to happen. And what happened Tuesday afternoon, Tuesday night, things were crazy happen. One time on the last day of spring training, all everybody wants to do is just pack their bags and get the hell home. And he sees Hideki Arabu stumble on his way to covering first, and he rips into Hideki Arabu, and he calls him a fat pussy toad. Now, so I'll leave it with you guys. Try and look at your computer and ask yourself, how do you spell pussy without getting in trouble? These were legitimate conversations that we were having with our newspaper offices back home. Now, I worked for the Star Ledger at the time. Okay, we actually had it easy because a couple months earlier, we started a long and prosperous relationship with the producers of The Sopranos. And you might remember on the show there was a character with the alternate name, and we actually broke the doors of decorum down by identifying that guy in the paper by his name. So all we had to worry about was finding an alternate spelling. Everybody else had other problems, like the Post. I wasn't working for at the time. They went with pussy rhymes with fussy, and that still is the way we refer to it now. If we ever refer to the Arabu incident, that is official New York Post style. It's pussy, quote unquote, rhymes with fussy. I mean, this is George. This is what happens around there. Where else do you have that? I don't care. Give me Jerry Jones and Mark Cuban and any other crazy owner you want to talk about. This was just a different chapter altogether.
As somebody who covered the team, do you miss those days?
Oh yeah. Look, I mean, if you look at the cover of the book, I mean, George is about 4 times as big as Hal, which is metaphorical and also accurate. Look, I mean, he owned the team much longer, and also when you're talking about larger than life personalities, I mean, it's just not close. I actually like Hal a lot, and I think he does a good job. I know a lot of Yankee fans would disagree with me on that. They think he's too patient. They think of a George Steinbrenner that just snapped his fingers, fired people, and then they won the World Series, which never happened. But that is something we miss because look, I mean, I work for the New York Post. We survive because of our back page, even in the digital area, in the digital era. Right? What do people want to do when something happens? They want to lift up the back page of the Post because usually it's funny or it's provocative or whatnot. And nobody was better at that than George. And sadly, nobody is worse for business than Hal because he's the anti-back page and he wants it that way. He likes it that way. He says my dad was about the back page and I'm about the back room, and he's true to that. So I do miss it. There's nobody like him around here anymore. Steve Cohen tried for a while. I think he's going to be quiet for a little bit now because his team isn't exactly backing up the boastful words he had on his way in the door. Steinbrenner said on day one, we're going to be back in the World Series in 3 years, and they were. Steve Cohen said we'd have multiple championships in 3 to 5, and that hasn't worked out so well for him. So I think that's another reason why you'll never see another Steinbrenner, because they don't want to wind up having to eat their words like Steve Cohen is.
I'll have to get Jeff to talk to you about the Mets one day separate. The book is The Bosses of the Bronx, the endless drama of the Yankees under the House of Steinbrenner. If you're a Yankees fan or honestly just someone who loves great sports stories, it's worth checking out. Mike, thanks so much for the time and good luck with it all.
Guys, I really appreciate this conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.